So welcome everybody, people who came live and also people who are watching the recording. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lisa Pinhorn. Myself and my sister operate a service called Empowered Parents, and we have been doing community work for over 25 years now. And about 10 years of that has been really working closely with families whose kids are diagnosed with or they're on the wait list, which I don't have to explain to people how long the wait list is because we've all probably lived through that. Um, uh, about 10 years of that with kids who've been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, uh, all of the other things like the OCD stuff, oppositional things, developmental trauma, just the whole umbrella of neurodiversity. So I've been going in and out of schools in ISSP meetings for about 10 years now. People have been inviting me to come in to sit and be the advocate within their system, within their IEP meetings or ISSP meetings for about 10 years. And I kind of thought a little while ago, I got a lot to share. So I just kind of thought I would jump on board and do a class tonight to talk about uh, kids in the school system primarily, I guess. And there's also other systems that we interface with like the family justice system or even the justice system. Uh, there's also other systems where we're advocating for our kids in a lot. And I say our kids because I have a daughter who's on the spectrum as well, who's 18 years old. And I have been advocating for her for a very long time. So I wanted to share all that kind of stuff. But tonight, primarily, we're going to go through these four kind of big points that are here on this main slide. And tonight is going to be a lot of maybe stuff that people don't understand about the international charters of human rights for children and also for people with disabilities. Is there anybody here who knows about these international charters, or is it totally brand new to them? Feel free to open up your mic if you want to chat, or if you want to put it in the chat box. I feel like, it's over 20 years ago when I graduated from my undergraduate degree. And every time I meet with parents, I feel like this is something that they don't really understand a lot of, like what are the basic human rights that children specifically have, and also people with disabilities. So if anybody feels comfortable putting that in the chat, I'd be really curious to know if it feels like, yeah, I think, April, that's a really, really good point. I think all of us could know more about those kinds of things. Oh, Jennifer just raised her hand. 1 second here now. Jennifer, did you want to open up your mic and say something? Or did you want to, wasn't sure.
Sorry, my connection's not very good, but I was what I was thinking when you said, the Charter of Rights, we often think of visible
Yeah,
disabilities and not really like
yeah,
things that we're facing with our kids who have
yeah,
different needs.
yeah, yeah. And I think that people go to that right away because the more visible ones are easier for us to see, right? And their needs are sometimes a little bit more visible. But I guess what we're gonna try to shine some light on tonight is the fact that any diagnosis is considered to be a disability means that those rights are just as valid for a person who, is in a wheelchair and may not have the ability to use words as it is for a person who has been diagnosed with autism, ADHD. So we're going to shine a light on that tonight. What I did was I collected up some videos that can explain this in a little bit easier, because if I was to sit here tonight and go through all of the different charters that are in all of these different rights documents, you would fall asleep and say, why did I ever sign up for such a boring thing to do? And I don't want to do that to people. What I hope is that it'll plant the seeds for you to maybe learn a little bit more about it, feel like if your child is in a situation where you feel like, we need to do some more work around understanding exactly what human rights are for your kid, then it might plant the seed to reach out and ask for more help or look at it from a different perspective. Because I hope if anybody leaves with a new phrase tonight, this is the phrase that I hope people leave with, is most of our systems are led with like, what are our kids' deficits? Like, let's fix all these deficits that they have. And what I'm hoping for is that we start a dialogue around how do we have a rights-led system, that we think about person's rights first before anything else. And that's a bit of a lane change for a lot of people. April, did you want to say something or do you want to type something there? I know you had your hand raised. See if you can unmute yourself. Sorry. Goodness, can't talk. Oh, I think you're still muted there, April. I don't know if I can unmute you or not.
Mute.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. You're there now.
Okay. I just had some issues recently with people in my son's school. He's only in grade 1, but like physically touching him, like in forceful ways of like moving him if he's not listening, things like this.
Yeah.
And I'm just really struggling with, I mean, obviously should not be happening. What
Yeah.
are my rights as a parent in that situation?
You have the rights as a parent to say to your school that nobody lays their hands on my child, no matter what. You
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
we don't do it at home.
Yeah.
So I hate that it's happening somewhere else.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
we don't have enough time to go into the details
Yeah.
now. It just feels gross to you, but
Yes.
it's traumatizing to our children when that
Yes.
happens to them. And
Yes.
there's enough trauma in people's childhood anyway without that happening in
Right.
a school setting. You have absolutely every right. Is your
Okay.
child diagnosed with autism?
He's ADHD already, and we're in the process of the autism as we speak.
Okay.
But
Well,
it's not diagnosed autism yet, but I
yeah.
mean, I would be very surprised if not.
You
The kind
absolutely
runs in the
have the
family.
right. I work with people who go to meetings and say, I don't want my child to be part of this, and in absolutely no uncertain terms should anybody lay their hands on my child. And you're
Yeah.
like, it's 100% within your rights to say it.
Okay.
Very good
Thank you so much.
question. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Keep that in mind as we go through the material, because there's ways to collaborate with people so that they understand why.
Yes, and I think some of it
Mm.
may be understanding and some may just be patience, perhaps in the moment,
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
I get that because I mean, it's why I've had to change who I am to get the patience.
yeah. Oh, no
Yeah.
question. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Can I
Okay.
ask you, April, are you in St. John's?
We're in paradise.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Okay. I think
Okay.
you're going to find this really interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to just cover a little bit of what I like to call nerd work, even though most people here might already know this, but I feel like it's important for us to sort of do the groundwork before we get into the meat and the potatoes here. Um, at Empowered Parents, we have firmly embraced the paradigm shift towards neurodiversity rather than talking about and neurodiversity is knowing and accepting that the movement is telling us that there has always been a neurodiverse population within the human species since the beginning of time. There has always been ADHD, there's always been autism, there's always been this kaleidoscope of neurodiversity in our communities. And in some cultures, it's held up and revered. And in the North American culture, it's looked like it's a deficit and that you're something left of normal. And we have made multiple commitments to the neurodiversity community to call out certain things when we see them. We don't participate or advocate for any more behavior modification programs. We are moving away from the puzzle piece. We are firmly embracing the infinity symbol, and we are trying to become as firm allies as we can to listen to the voices of neurodiverse adults and adolescents and children who are telling us what their world is like. We're stopping looking at people like they are broken and really trying to lift people up to create community where people feel like they belong, that they don't have to change who they are to fit. That's the neurodiversity movement. It's being led by really powerful adults in the neurodiversity world who are really vocal about what school was like for them, what it was like to be a child of divorce who was forced to like slag their body between two houses when they couldn't do it, all of that kind of stuff. We're really, really listening to the voices of neurodiverse people, and we have to change lanes. We got to. We don't have a choice. So that's what neurodiversity is. We're just going to flick through the beginning of this really quickly so we can get to the meat and the potatoes here. And we need neurodiversity to challenge really outdated ideas, to show us about what it feels like to be authentic in this world, you know, to show us about change and perspective and how we need to embrace this idea that everybody brings something beautiful to the table. Has been very challenging, but this is the road that we're on now. It's really exciting. And it's to know that we're changing and that things are changing and it's happening because of the voices of neurodiverse people is a beautiful thing. That we accept, like, this is the umbrella of people who we're looking at in the neurodiversity categories, the whole umbrella of it. And even now, like, we're stopping at empowered parents. We're dropping the D, the disordered word, out of everything. We're not saying autism spectrum disorder. I'll say autism spectrum. I will say autistic. My kiddo still likes to say Asperger's because that's where she fits. You know, there's lots of language changes that we can move away from. I don't even like saying learning disability anymore. I like saying learning difference. There's a whole bunch of things. So we're looking at this big, broad, beautiful rainbow and umbrella of people who just, what is typical? Like, we've got to ask ourselves, like, what does that mean? You know, what this whole idea about there's only one way to be has really done a lot of damage to a lot of vulnerable populations of people. It really has. So we're looking at this whole beautiful umbrella of people. And this is just another way of looking at it. I love NeuroWild. I love that resource. If anybody's active on social media, she does some beautiful work every day. She posts a new little cartoon. And what we're trying to do is that, you know, when we have to go into these meetings and advocate for our children, we have to really look at what people are suggesting, the interventions that they're doing, the things that they're doing. Are our children being forced to be something that they're not? Is their neurodiversity being policed? You know, is it having, like, if you have to flap your hands, is there somebody saying, sit on your hands? If you're stimming, are people telling you not to stim? If you need to move, are people telling you not to move? That would be neuropolicing, in my opinion. We're trying not to gender police people anymore. People get to show up whoever they are in whatever flavor they choose to be that day. And we are trying to make spaces more accepting and understanding of all the beautiful things around us. And how do we make those spaces more neuroaffirming, neuro-aware, so that people can walk into spaces and be who they are. So we want to talk a little bit about disability. People think that disability is a a thing where it's only this really small population of people, but we know now that and I saw it happen in my family. You know, I have a child in my life who has a disability, born with a disability, but I watched my father age into a disability. I've watched my mother age into a disability. And a significant amount of us age into disability if we're not already born with it. So almost somewhere around 16% of the Canadian population are living with some type of disability. I don't love the language, but here we are. That's why we know what it is. So almost like over 200,000 of those people are children and youth. There's a lot of us. And they are minorities. Even though there are a lot of people in Canada, in Newfoundland, with a disability, they are still a minority. in the neurodiverse world, we're calling them neural minorities. I don't mean to say them. I'd hate to other people and them people, because I do consider myself to be somewhere under the umbrella too. When your child is in the school system and they are in what is meant to be an inclusive classroom, they are a neuro minority. Even though there's more and more kids getting diagnosed every year, they are a neuro minority. And being a minority means you are coming with two significant international charters of rights that you can bring to the table when you're advocating for your kid and their needs. You just don't have to say, oh, can we not do this? You can say, if what you're suggesting is actually against his human rights as a child and as a disabled person, because there's two international charters that are protecting people for what their rights are. And we're going to get to what those are in a little bit. So ableism is a word that people sometimes know, sometimes don't really kind of understand what it is. And we kind of touched on that a little bit already. But here's ableism and what it is. It is this idea that, or belief that it's normal to not have a disability, if that makes sense to people. And that normal, and whatever that is the preferred way to be. And what ends up happening in those situations when we start to see people as broken or as needing to be a different way, what ends up happening is human rights factors come into play, but there's also this long-term issues with mental health that our children are exposed to, whether it is, trauma, or they feel invisible, or they have to pretend to be something that they're not in spaces in order to feel like they fit in. So there's lots of people who will say, the neurodiversity is not the problem, the ableism and the ideas that we have around it. I'll just give one example of probably the worst ableism that I've seen in my world during COVID. So there's a significant population of people living in Canada with significant learning disabilities for numbers, math, letters, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if people remember, but when we were all lining up to get our COVID vaccinations, we were handed a piece of paper every single time, and we were asked to fill out a form. And I know in the population of people that I work with, and I finished a project not too long ago with the Learning Disabilities Association, I know there were people who did not get their COVID vaccinations because they couldn't fill out the forms. And they were too embarrassed to ask for help. So when people were designing the system of doing vaccinations, nobody said, well, what about the adults who can't read, completely invisible, or who can't organize to fill out a form, who can't, transfer their MCP number from a card into a form. And so that whole thing didn't think about people with a disability when they were filling out the form. So when I was walking through getting my vaccinations, I was like, I saw people turn around and leave when they were past the form because they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't do it themselves. So there's the ableism is also kind of cooked into the system. It is the system. The systems are not catching up with the lived experience of neurodivergent families. It's just not catching up yet. So unfortunately, it will be us who are the parents to try to do some of this shifting and changing. And it happens when we interface directly with teachers, with principals, with family law lawyers, when we interface with police. I've worked with a young person who unfortunately had to interface with the police while she was in a system of deep grief because of the death of a parent, and ended up being connected with the justice system and having to advocate for her through trying to keep this young autistic person out of jail because she didn't belong in jail. She was behaving like an autistic behaves, and it landed her in jail. So there's this whole ableism that's in the justice system, the family justice system, the school system. It's omnipresent everywhere, from this deep hangover of there's only one way to be. And if you're not perfect and normal, then you're broken and we need to fix you. So that's ableism. And the systems around us are full of ableism. That's one of the things when we're advocating for our children, is that we have to go into these meetings knowing that that exists. It's not like, oh, I wonder, is this place full of ableism? We have to know that it's there. The same way that I know if my car runs out of gas, I need to put gas in my car. When we start to advocate and interface with our children in these systems, we need to know that the ableism is there. I'm just going to pause for a second and ask people if my audio is choppy or if the camera is okay, if everything feels okay.
Seems great.
Okay, great, thanks. My modem is far away, and I don't ever know if my booster is really ever working. So I was going to stop and check. Okay. So here's one of the things that helps with us around our ableism ideas, is that our culture, modern day North American culture, likes to pathologize everything. And we like to say words like pathological demand avoidance and pathological blah, blah, blah. So we're trying to stop looking at all of the things that make our children fall into the category of neurodiversity, and stop looking at it like there's something wrong with it. Because this is the neurotype. This is the neurodiversity that we bring into places. The autistic communication style is just that. It is how my kid reminds me every day, I'm autistic. This is the way I talk. She tells me every day, brains are different. There's like 18 different types of ADHD brains. There's just everybody. We're still stuck in what we call a medical model, which is, this doesn't look quite right. Let's they use distinguish that behavior and then reinforce something that looks more normal. That's the medical model. And we're trying to move to a more social model that accepts everybody for who they are, essentially, is what it is. So we're going to start normalizing things. So when we sit in meetings and we hear people say, well, she needs to be able to sit for blah, 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 or how long, or needs to raise her hand to ask to go to the bathroom, or needs to, learn how to use a pencil, because not everybody's going to learn how to use a pencil, and saying that we're going to work really hard towards those kinds of things. Are we neuropolicing, or are we pathologically saying this is a pathological thing, or this is an abnormal thing, rather than saying this is autism, or this is ADHD, this is a learning disability? Let's give them the technology and the things that they need in order to thrive as who they are, as opposed to looking at it like it's broken. That's essentially what we're talking about here. So this is the medical model, and this is just something for people to think about. There's no reason to, jump too deep into this kind of stuff right now. But when we look at people with disabilities, do we look at them and go, oh, poor them? Or, people in wheelchairs, or people with cerebral palsy, or people with all different kinds of what we consider to be deficits or disabilities. And, can we shift from the medical model into the more social model of disability, with this radical acceptance that the neurodiversity is a lifespan. It changes and it morphs as people get older. Puberty has a big effect. Believe me, I know. There's, it changes and it morphs, but your neurodiversity is with you for life. And how do we let people live in their own skins, essentially? And what are the barriers that we see regularly? The neurodiversity family culture is very unique. It is not the same as people who have typical children, hate the word, but I don't know what else to say in this conversation. Most people do not have to worry about advocating for their kids at their school. They drop them off in the morning and they pick them up at after school, or they skip off to after school programs. They don't have to sit in meetings and advocate for their children, or ask for special services, or ask for an extra iPad with a communication app on it. They don't have to do that. The culture of neurodiverse families is very unique. And there's some areas of disabilities that do this really well. The deaf family culture, when your child gets their diagnosis of their hearing impairment, the deaf culture, they open up their doors and they take you in. And they say, this is the culture. This is what we have to do to support our children. This is our language. We have our own culture. We have everything here within the needs of our world is here. We don't do that in the neurodiverse world. But my experience as a parent is very different. Well, I had two kids, same gender, just 3 years apart. One of my kids could skip off to school. My other kid couldn't. So had this experience of parenting in very different ways for those two different kids. So we have to think a little bit about, those questions around, our culture. And sometimes when we come into these meetings with phrases like ableism, human rights, neurominorities, that's your view of that it's pathological is not. If we start using this language, then it gets people's attention. It makes people kind of go, oh, that's a new phrase. I've never heard that before. Which not this year, I was in an ISSP meeting. The principal had never heard the word neurodiversity before, and said, well, I learned something new today. This is a new word to me. So when we start to bring this language into the meetings and into our places where we have to advocate, we're planting the seeds for people to understand that they don't know about our world, right? So if you follow us on social media around the month of April, we always start posting, because it's Autism Acceptance Month, Autism Awareness Month. We start posting our commitments to the neurodiversity community. One of our commitments to the neurodiversity community is that we are calling out ableism about autism and neurodiverse people every single time we see it. So when I am in a meeting, I go, that feels we might want to check our ableism here. I live in this world. I teach it. I live it every day. Every day, I got to put my feet on the floor in the morning. I got to check my own ableism. And because it's all over the place, my kid reminds me of it all the time. So, you got to check yourself. You got to check your biases. You got to check yourself. I check myself around my ableism all the time, because it is, it's a barrier for people to get services, to feel seen, to feel safe. So I think that's it for the ableism and the neurodiversity. I just want to pause here for 1 second before we get into all of this human rights stuff, and see if anybody has any sort of questions or comments that they might want to say before we jump into the human rights stuff. Okay. A quick Google when you're done here, or some other day when you've got nothing to do, which I know you're allowed to roll your eyes. When do people have nothing to do? You can get volumes and volumes and volumes of information about all of these human rights charters. And like I said, if I had decided to print this all off, you'd be bored out of your mind. But you need to know that the takeaway from this is that there's international, the observance of special days and special months and weeks and all of that kind of stuff. And December 3rd is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And that comes from the United Nations. It was in 1992. And this is this whole idea about the disability charter. That's an international charter. And the good thing about it is that it was actually written by disabled people. So it's really empowering to jump into this, to see all the places that it was, that it's sort of been, that it comes from. So this is people with all disabilities. This is, it tries to mobilize support for inclusion of people with disabilities, promote awareness. And this is physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, neurodiversity, autism, all of it, the whole umbrella of a disability, to try to make things as inclusive as possible. Now, sometimes people might think, oh, well, that's, just people flapping their gums and wearing a certain color t-shirt once a year. But it is, it has impact because people can, say, this is, today's this day, and we can, in December 3rd, we can all talk about it, post about it, bring it to light, because we do have our own special category of human rights. So this is what we posted on December 3rd this year. We wanted to talk about the difference between fitting in and belonging, because this is ableism in real time. And I find that inclusive systems right now that call themselves inclusive have a real sort of difficulty with this idea between a place where you feel like you belong and a place where you feel like it's important for me to fit in. And so we hear the words in IEPs all the time that our kids need to get better social skills so they will fit in. It's written in IEP goals all the time, rather than saying, how do we change the structure here so this person feels like they belong? How do we put the onus on the system to change rather than the child or the person with the disability to change so that they fit in? Because when you are in a place where you feel like you belong, it's a very different feeling to when you are changing who you are to fit in. And a lot of times now, the emphasis is on, well, this person needs to change who they are in order to fit. So that's another part of ableism that's really deeply entrenched in a lot of our systems. And belonging, if we have a setting and a system where there's belonging, there's very deep empathy for the people who are managing these systems, a full acceptance of neurodiversity. We adjust our expectations, and we're constantly checking ourselves for our ableist ideas. So that's a real sort of red flag in your meetings with people in the school system or the family justice system or any kind of system at all. If it's this accepted thing around people changing to fit in, it's a big ableism flag. And even simple things like forcing people to make eye contact, forcing people to give hugs, all of those kinds of things, right? And we would like to think that this whole idea about forcing people to do eye contact, that's gone with the dodo bird, and it is not. Like, I heard a classroom teacher say one day, this kid, by the end of kindergarten, he's going to say hello to me, he's going to say goodbye to me, and he's going to give me a high five, and he's going to make eye contact with me. Like, that was her goal. All of it was ableist for this kid. Couldn't do it. And it was really difficult to try to get this person to understand why it was ableist to expect that. So those stories are sadly still with us. Hang on a second here. Now I just got to close a couple things. I don't know why this slide is doing this, but I really like how it came down that way. So we're going to talk about the human rights of the internet. This is the United Nations human rights. And so all human beings all across the planet have, it's inherent to everybody. It doesn't matter about the country that you're from, your gender, your ethnic origin, religion, whatever it is. Human rights are basic freedoms for everybody is entitled to. And that is the same no matter where we are. We all have basic human rights. So they're doing some really great work in Scotland. And I wanted to share this because I think they've got a that's called they've written a paper that's called the State of Human Rights Report. Now it's a little dated. It's 2017. It's not that long ago, but what they're suggesting in Scotland, and I believe that we should also be suggesting this, is that we have a rights-based approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach. That when we walk into places, we say, this person has the right as a disabled person or a child to move around the classroom. This person has a right to not be secluded, to not be punished for being a neurodiverse person, because that's their right. That's their human birthright to be who they are in an open and welcoming space. So if we ground our processes in this first, and there's nothing wrong with going into meetings and saying, the lens of this meeting is going to be, we're going to make decisions based on my child's human rights. That's going to be our guiding light. And let's see then if we can put some parameters around the interventions or the time that they're there, all of that kind of stuff. I think it's a really nice, a really interesting way to walk into meetings when we're advocating for our kids. It's a new way to look at it. I'm going to show this video. I hope it works. So these videos that I've got queued up here are going to help us understand some of these human rights things a little bit better. So this is the rights. I'm just going to read what Abel said. Yeah, I know. Masking is a big issue in our world. Hang on a second now. Just want to make sure that I can see everybody's chat. Okay, so let's play this video. People can give me a thumbs up if the audio is okay. Can you hear it?
Everyone has human rights, including children, and every child in the world has the same human rights. Because children are in a special stage of development, they have a special set of rights to ensure that they are protected, nurtured, and empowered to take part in society. Why are rights so special? Rights are for all children. They are universal. Rights are there at birth. They are inherent. Rights cannot be taken away. They are inalienable. Rights do not have to be earned. They are unconditional. All rights are equally important. They are indivisible. The Convention on the Rights of the Child lists the rights that children have through 42 articles. It also explains how governments, UNICEF, and other organizations work to ensure all children enjoy their rights. Governments around the world have ratified the convention, including Canada in 1991. This means all levels of government in Canada have promised to respect, protect, and fulfill children's rights in law. There are 4 general principles that underpin all children's rights. Non-discrimination. This means all children have these rights regardless of their nationality, gender, ethnicity, religion, language, or any other status. And no child should be treated unfairly for any reason. Best interests. This means all adults should consider the impact of their decisions on children and always do what's best for them. Survival and development. This means governments must make sure that children survive and develop in the best possible way to achieve their full potential. Views of the child. This means children have a right to express their views on matters that affect them, and adults should listen and take them seriously. The convention covers every aspect of a child's daily life at home, at school, in the community, and in our society. Learning about children's rights can help children and adults develop relationships based on respect. The government and anyone working for the government is responsible for ensuring that children's rights are realized for every child. All adults can play their part. For more information, visit www.unicef.ca.
So I think the important part to take out of that is, it is for me when I watch that, the important part that I take out of that is that children, children have the right for other people to see their skills and lift them up. Like, they have the right to be seen for who they are. There's a lot of stuff in the charter that's about like right to a house and right to food and right to like not living in danger and all that kind of stuff. And we could talk about that forever, but that's not what I feel is important for us to talk about here tonight. It's that, like, I go back to what's in the best interest of this child. That is the phrase that I think would be super powerful to bring into meetings when we're advocating for our children. Like, what is right here, right now, what is in the best interest of this child, my child, in this place? And unfortunately, you'll probably get some people say, well, the best interest of your child right now is that they learn how to use a pencil. And some kids never learn how to use a pencil. They don't have the capacity to do it. Their disability or their neurodiversity or whatever it is means that they won't. They might get there eventually, but they might not get there during grade 2. And we need to be okay with that and provide other things for that child. Like, what is in the best interest of this child? Is it communication? Well, let's give them all the technology that they need in order for that to happen. I think that's probably one of the big take-home things for people should be is that phrase. Is this in the best interest of my neurodiverse child? Remove all the ableism, remove all the old garbage thoughts that we have about perfectionism and normalism and all that kind of stuff, all the isms. Like, let's remove it and say, what's in the best interest of this child right now? So I'm not going to get into this because we've already talked about it, but this is a legally binding document that we can go back to. There's pillars in these documents that we can go back to that says, like, everybody has the right to protection and education, survival, protection, and education. So we can start thinking about, well, what happens when somebody says maybe your kid should only go to school on half days? Or we don't have a student assistant for your kid today, so can they stay home? Happens a lot, right? An awful lot. There's the student assistant, we don't have one today, or what, or we don't have extra help. Maybe your kid can't be in the Christmas concert, right? That happens too. So I'm just checking the chat here, 1 second. Oh, did it? Oh, yeah. Like, it's not a made up story. It happens, unfortunately. Yeah. So, it is, people have the right to socialize within the parameters of their diversity. They have the rights to participate. They have the rights for education. They have the rights for everything. So in those ways, so going into those situations, if you say, well, this is actually against this person's human rights, it gets people's attention, right? So I'm not going to go into too much of these because we already talked about it, but there's a lot of articles and there's lots of domains. Just know that protection and participation and provision is like omnipresent in this whole document. It's very big. Obviously, we're just planting seeds here now. We talked about best interests of the child, survival and development, the respective views of children. Like, this is really difficult for us to get our heads around. We have to ask children, what do they want? What do they want in this situation? They have the right to say what they think in the matters that are affecting them. They have the right to say, no, I don't want to go. They have the right to say, please get me there. They have the right to say no and yes to things. That's really hard for us to get our heads around, but they have the right. I was working with this girl. She's living in a group home, and she hurt her arm, and she kept one of those people who kept on going back to the emergency room. They couldn't fix it at the emergency room. She had like a stress injury. She wanted to go back. She wanted to go back all the time because her arm was really hurting. And the staff were getting really oppositional about having to take her to emergency every, week or so. But the person who managed the group home said, it's in her right to be seen medically for a thing that she has going on. And if the person who was organizing and organizing this living situation with this person didn't understand that, she wouldn't have been seen medically. But you have the right. People have the right to say what they want to do and what they don't want to do. So I like this Article 6 too, right? Governments must do all they do. They do all that they can to develop children's full potential. Now that might not look like a person with no neurodiversity, but their full potential is completely different. And they have potential. So these are great things to sort of language to toss in, right? The best interest of the child. The charter, article number 6, charter 54 says, they have the right to develop to their full potential. And this is just another one about the right to education. I love this part, the right to develop every child's personality, talents, abilities to full. Like, that's a big one, right? The right to relax, play, and take part in a wide range of cultural and artistic activities. Also beautiful. And respect to children's dignity, the right to education, and respect to children's dignity, which means seclusion, physically putting your hands on people, all of that kind of stuff falls into that category too, in my opinion. So let's get into the disability world. You probably have heard this phrase before, nothing about us without us. And we got a couple of videos here. April, your hand is still raised there. I'm just wondering if you had something that you wanted to say, or is that from before? Okay, all right, okay. So let's just have a look at this, because this is a nice way. I know it might be a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to show a little video in a while, but I like this because it takes this very complicated legal document and puts it into like some of the big things that the rights of the person with disability has. The right to live independently within a community, freedom, to not be exploited or, torture, access to health, education, the right to life, the right to be respected, the right for participation and inclusion, the right for privacy. Like, think about that for a second. The right to privacy, the right to participate in cultural life and recreation, legal and sport, the right to an adequate standard of living and social protections. So there's a lot of accessibility. How could we not talk about that, right? Like, so much with accessibility, so many barriers, invisible barriers that are only felt and seen by a certain population of people. So there's a lot to unpack in the Charter of Rights for Disabled People. But let's just have a little quick watch of this video, and then we can move on to like meetings and those kinds of things and how they might look for people.
What is the UNCRPD? Watch our previous video to find out more about the United Nations. In 2006, the United Nations made a treaty. The treaty is called United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD for short. Many countries have become part of the UNCRPD. The UNCRPD talks about how countries should make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights as others. For example, countries should make sure that people with disabilities can live independently. This means that they should be able to live on their own within the community. Countries should make things accessible to people with disabilities. This means changing things so people with disabilities can use them. For example, by using sign language or by using easy language. Countries should make sure that people with disabilities can make their own decisions. This means that no one else should make these decisions for them. Countries should also make sure that people with disabilities have access to healthcare and can live in safety. The UNCRPD is very important for people with disabilities. This includes people with intellectual disabilities. People with disabilities can use the UNCRPD to make everyone respect their rights.
Now, obviously, our little kids or even older kids, we can teach them to advocate for themselves, right? That's a really big part of neurodiversity, is how we teach children to be able to walk into spaces and advocate for themselves, but we can't assume that they're going to be able to do that all the time, or that they're in safe enough places to be able to do that. So when our kids are little, unfortunately, this is our job, to remind people about their human rights. And not everybody wants to listen to that, but it's these two big international charters are there for a reason, because we need to be reminded of them, and we need to be able to remind people of them. Well, oops, sorry about that. I'm going to move this one out of the way. So in the 1970s, when they were shutting down all the specialized schools, and including this umbrella of inclusion and inclusive educations in systems in place, parents worked really hard for that to happen. Special needs parents, just a second here now. Crazy, a child had to leave school early for hours or a whole week. Yeah, I know. It's about funding too, right? We're not in, unfortunately, we just don't have the resources financially to support all the stuff that people need, which is against everybody's human rights. Like the fact that the funding isn't there is also makes it so that the system is inherently ableist in its processes. So it's always going to come back down to funding for certain. But if our systems changed and people felt more safe, would they need all that extra support, right? If people were looking at our kids like they were, belonging and accepted and all that kind of stuff, would things change radically for people? I argue that it would. People would still need help and assistance, but they would be walking into a different space every day, right? When parents in the 70s, late 60s and 70s fought really hard for their kids to be included inside school settings, what we have right now is not what they wished for. They wished that their kids were going to go into schools and they were going to have a beautiful experience inside schools. And this idea about systematic ableism, policing neurodiverse kids, the idea of compliance, like just everybody wins when kids sit and be quiet. This idea about that, seclusion rooms. I don't know if people are dealing with those kinds of issues, where there's actual spaces inside rooms where children are put inside little padded rooms, happening everywhere in the education system. This idea that we're going to ignore people to change their behavior, all these physical restraints, holding children, lockdowns. I've worked with a family where, here in the city, where their autistic kid, the principal called the police one day when they had a meltdown. And that was in an elementary school. This is not the inclusive system that the parents of the 70s fought like tooth and nail just to get. But this is where we are. So this is the system. And how do we go into these meetings that we need to do to advocate for our children, really sort of empowered and aware about what our rights are? Because these international charters are there for a reason. And, somebody in St. John's can be in a meeting talking about that. Somebody in Alberta can be talking about that. Somebody in Calcutta can be talking about it. It makes this a universal tool for people. So let's just, in the time that we have left, talk a little bit about, because there's not much time left, but we can hang around for a little bit longer. And if people need to take off, they can watch the end of this in the recording. I can't stress enough how important it is, if you have to go into these meetings, to not go alone. To think about any professional who has touched the lives of your children, whether it's an OT, a psychologist, a naturopath, a speech language person, it could be an art therapist, gymnastics teacher, music teacher, whoever it is, who can paint a full picture of your child's skills, and that comes into the meeting too. So we want to have it, trying to advocate for our children in systems that we already know are ableist and broken and all that kind of stuff. But then we have to like change lanes and walk in and not be combative until we really have to be. Like sometimes you got to be, but in the beginning, how do we ask that everybody comes together and collaborate that's in the best interests of our child? So what we're trying to ask people to think about when people come together, and this could be any group of professionals. This is not just in the school system. This could be family law lawyers. It could be people in an after school program. It could be anybody. We're just talking about a really collaborative approach, professionals together, where we can say, this is my child in my house. This is the services that are around us. And if they're not services that are around us, how does the school help us get those services? Schools are in our communities because community schools are supposed to help people within their community. They're supposed to be this bridge into other services and places. That's why we build little schools in communities. We're not so good at that anymore, but elementary schools in particular, little schools in communities, that's what we're trying to, that was the philosophy. It was the hub where we all came to get our stuff. So if we don't have access to services, how does the school help us? Now, unfortunately, we're the only province in Canada that doesn't have social workers or occupational therapists in schools. So Newfoundland is a little bit behind when it comes to that. But how do we do a rights-based approach, truly collaborative, with the neurodiversity family culture at the center, saying this is what our culture is like. So I always say to people, you don't need an IEP meeting, you need an ISP meeting. You need to be able to pull everybody in. And the ISSP meeting was something that was fought really hard for by parents in order to be able to have this true collaborative approach. And the ISSP meeting, you can invite anybody. You can invite the milkman. You can invite your tax accountant, an advocate, your parents. You can invite absolutely anybody to these meetings so that you feel supported and that you're able to paint a full picture of your child's life and the services that you have around them. Well, Jennifer, that's a really good question. How do we advocate for, they've always said this is the year the OTs are coming, and I'm going gray watching it happen. They're not there yet. They do have access to some of the OTs at the Janeway who will come to ISSP meetings, but they're not really in the schools per se. They're at the Janeway. They're not in the schools. And if you live in Grand Falls, then the fact that your OTs at the Janeway don't matter, so. Yeah, so here's some of the things about to set the stage for a better partnership, because unfortunately, we do need to be able to communicate with people. This is going to sound really difficult sometimes because we can feel, I don't have to go to ISSP meetings anymore, but I mean, this is my academic background and I felt intimidated in these meetings where I had to advocate for my kid. But feeling like you're the leader, you are the team leader here. If somebody hasn't reached out to you yet, it's March. Somebody hasn't reached out to you yet about an ISSP meeting for planning for your kids next year in September, you have the right to pick up the phone and say, I want an ISSP meeting. And this is the people who I'm inviting. Let's pick a date. You have this March to June is transition planning time, right? So if you don't have, if nobody is reaching out to you about an ISSP meeting, you are 100% in your right to do that. And you almost have to assume that people don't know about the autism or the anxiety or the OCD. These are really complicated developmental disabilities, especially about developmental trauma and sensory processing stuff. You can't assume that everybody who's on the ISSP team understands about it. So sometimes we're starting from scratch too. In education, people, a whole new team of people every year at the school. Unfortunately, sometimes we're there. And just, yeah, the waiting lists are horrible. I mean, I do think that it's going to be an election year soon. This is another reason why I get so hot on this topic. Like every year, there's a bunch of promises that are going to happen around election time within the school system, and in other systems too. And, you know, there was a big cry about 5 years ago about the wait list, and then it seemed it got taken care of, and now it's gone crazy again. It's really, the wait lists are really, really long. And OT is 2 years. Assessment time now is 2 years, or 18 months. It's really horrible. So here's the team: parents, principal, teacher, an advocate. If you want to invite anybody to come with you, this is an American picture, so they still say special education there. If you've got speech language, the other interesting thing that happens is that student assistants are always excluded from these meetings. And sometimes the student assistant is the person who knows your kid the best. And how do we get their voices in meetings too is another thing to think about. I'm just going to blow through these things because if anybody feels like they need to leave, we are at 8 o'clock. Can't stress enough of the level of communication that's necessary. It's like reaching out to the school on a regular basis, or reaching out to your family law lawyer, or reaching out to whoever to make sure that everybody is communicating and open, and, you know, saying how things are today. And even if it's meeting at, you know, a little chat at the door, it's something like that, or the ability to be able to send emails and saying like, my kid had a really hard night's sleep, or if they didn't eat breakfast today. Like, to be, even those day-to-day communication stuff is really really important. But, you know, let's say this has happened with a family that I was working with when we started working together. The ADHD diagnosis was there, and then a month or two into work, then the learning disabilities diagnosis came, and then there was another whole kind of communication and information that needed to get sent to the school about the learning disabilities. So the learning disabilities diagnosis and stuff like that. So the more information that we give, the more eyes that are on it. I've never ever regretted more eyeballs on a situation to paint a full picture of what's going on with your child and their whole life. And I mean their whole life. So we're talking about collaboration and cooperation and communication. And this is fine in the beginning, but there are times when, you know, we got to push a little harder. We got to make those extra telephone calls. We got to be able to say to people, you know, this is, who do I go above when this happens? Who do I call in? And if anybody feels like they're in a situation where they feel like, you know, whatever is going on in this situation with my child doesn't feel right anymore. It feels like their rights are being violated. It feels like they're the person who we've, you know, if plans fall apart, or if it's revisiting the same issue over and over and over again, and you don't know who the next person to call is in that system, reach out to me. I know who they are. If you feel like I want to invite the Child Youth Advocate Office to my ISSP meeting, they will come. They've been in meetings with me. You can invite somebody from the Learning Disabilities Association to come to your ISSP meeting. You can invite somebody from the Autism Society to come. You can hire an advocate. You can do all kinds of things. But sometimes you need to go to the next level, and you need to be able to say in firmness, you know, my child will never be secluded. My child will never be restrained. My child will, and sometimes you have to get firm on that, and you need to have the right people in your corner when you're having those conversations with people. So I am going to just flip through, because I think we talked about most of these things. I'm going to take down my slides. We're going to talk way more about this at our next virtual workshop that we're starting in the next few weeks. If anybody wants any information about that, we're going to talk a lot about neuroaffirming practices, advocating emotional safety, and all that kind of stuff for neurodiverse families. I'm going to take this down and see. I know a couple people had to scoot. I don't know what this is. 1 second here now. I'm going to end the slideshow and take that down. Okay. I know that there was a lot of information here, and I blew a lot of stuff at people. I think it's a really important topic. I think that the more parents understand what their basic human rights are, the more that we can go into these meetings with the language that gets people's attention, which would be really great. And not all schools are bad places for our kids to be. There are some beautiful people out there working in the system who love their jobs and understand this stuff. But unfortunately for us, it feels a little bit like it's difficult in that we don't feel seen in places. And it's not just the school system. It's the, like I said, it's the family justice system. It's all kinds it's the medical system. We could be doing this whole thing about the medical system too, right? You know, when our kids have to go to the Janeway for dental surgery, what's the ableism that happens there? When our kids are going to see, you know, people in the rehab centers or whatever, there's lots of ableism in those systems too. There's lots of ableism in the speech language world. There's lots of ableism, especially in the behavior modification world, all of that kind of stuff. So I know we kind of talked more about schools today because in the beginning people talked about that. So there's lots of those issues, and we're advocating for our kids in almost all of those systems too. And then there's a bigger problem with whole system advocating, you know, like our kids age out at 18. There's no services. 18, there's nothing. So that's a big problem, right? So I kind of hope that maybe today we sort of lit a fire under people, and also that they know where to reach out to if they feel like that they want some answers about what are next steps for people. Then we're always around to help people with that. And we have a really great relationship with a lot of the on the ground associations out there doing work. So we can always connect people with those nonprofit organizations too. So before we go, does anybody feel like they want to say anything? I'm gonna stop recording. So people, if they feel like it's a little bit safer to chat, they can do that. Anyway, thanks for coming and watching, but I'm not closing the meeting. I'm just stopping the recording.